session for April 12th, 2023. Jessica, will you please take roll?
Elisa Monteblanco.
Here.
Barbie Miner.
Here.
Alfredo Moreno. Alfredo Moreno.
His sound
He's
isn't
here.
working.
His sound isn't working. He's here.
Sorry, I can't see anybody right now. Heidi Everts.
Here.
Here.
Thank you, Jessica, and welcome, Alfredo. We have one big topic for our work session today, and that is sustainable operating and financial models. Take it away, Doug.
All right, I'm going to launch us off, and we'll have a variety of staff members speaking into the PowerPoint presentation-wise. So certainly, as you know, last month's presentation, plus the mid-year budget meeting, we're entering the last quarter for current fiscal. And we're preparing a balanced budget for next fiscal, but of course, looking ahead, due to a combination of some pretty significant factors, all the way from the continuing impact of the pandemic, increased personnel costs that have been essential to be competitive in today's labor market, inflation, and all of the other things we've discussed in detail in the last month's meeting. We know with the way our expenses are growing, that our revenues just aren't keeping up. We're going to have the necessity to take some action to better balance the scales. We're not alone, of course. Many of you are more than active enough. You've heard the discussions for the variety of different agencies that are facing, very significant challenges as well. Many of them are coming right now. Ours is a bit out, but of course the best planning is to move when you know and can anticipate that there are some challenges. So the management team, we've been working hard at pulling tonight's information together for our discussion with the board. We're going to go some 20-ish minutes, and then of course we'll open it up for dialogue questions as we move forward. So with that, Aisha, will you kick us off, please?
Thank you, Doug. Yes, good evening, board members. I'm going to start us with a quick recap of our March meeting and what we discussed last month. You see the big caution sign on this slide, and we know that's because we have
slide, please.
Sorry, next slide. So yes, again, we are providing a quick recap of our March meeting. Here on the right side of the slide, you can see the caution sign, and that is to indicate that we're aware, we know that we have a really huge gap coming in our budget, because as we discussed last month, as we look forward 5 years into the future, we would need to cut our budget by 21% or $16 million in order to balance. And as you can see with our escalating personnel costs that we've discussed with you, losing half of our materials and services budget, as well as nearly wiping out our contingency and our capital replacement fund going to zero, we would not be able to operate the district in those conditions. So we know that inaction is not an option and that we need to act. Next slide, please. But the important part to know is that we can breathe tonight. We don't need to make decisions, but we do need to explore our options. We will need your input on which options you want us to pursue, as well as those that may be deal breakers for you. We have time to build a plan of action, and at this point, we're looking for your direction on what pathways we should be looking down. We want to take a quick moment to review where our funding comes from and how it's distributed to our various divisions and departments. And then we're going to have a very challenging conversation about the realities of what THPRD would look like if we had to reduce our spending by 21%. We're going to be very honest, and this part of our conversation is not going to be easy. Our approach to preparing the information that we're going to be sharing with you tonight was to ask each division to tell us what their services would look like if we had to reduce spending so drastically. We're talking about $1 of every $5 that we spend in a year that would have to be cut. And that's going to have a significant impact. We spread those cuts evenly across each division. So for example, the division I lead, Park Services, has a $16.4 million budget in FY24. So staff and I looked at what we could deliver if we had to cut our spending by $2.2 million. We want to emphasize that we're not saying these are the exact reductions we would be recommending. Instead, we wanted to help illustrate a picture for you and give you some context to the types of serious reductions in services we'd have to achieve in order to balance our budget. And we know our personnel are our greatest strength and our greatest expense, so the impacts on staffing would be incredibly drastic. So as we move into this, we're going to preview some of our revenue enhancement models in addition to telling that story, and give you some early thoughts on how much revenue we think could be likely from those options. We also recognize that raising revenues adds more pressure on families' budgets, so we want to ensure that we're mitigating those impacts for the families that rely on our financial assistance. But that's why we're here, to look at those tough realities and talk about the way we can move forward together. On the next slide, Jared's going to walk you through some additional information.
Thank you. So just a quick reminder about where our major sources of revenue come from. Next fiscal year, 53% of our funding will come from property taxes. Now, typically, property taxes represent between 60 and 66% of the general fund resources. The reason for property taxes representing a lower portion of the resources next year is because our cash carry forward is unusually high due to salary savings from unfilled positions. So while it is really nice to have a healthy carry forward, we typically rely on property taxes for almost 2/3 of our funding. Now, what complicates this is in 1997, Oregon voters passed Measure 50, which limits the growth of property taxes to 3% of assessed value per year. Now, as you can imagine, when you have economic cycles like what we're experiencing now, particularly in terms of inflation, if 2 out of every $3 you rely on is limited to a 3% growth, you really have a hard time keeping up with your growing expenses. Now, the math is really working against local governments in Oregon, which is why we see so many municipal governments and special districts in Oregon turning to local option levies to fill budget gaps heavily influenced by our state's tax structure. Next slide, please. Now, when we look at our department expenses, approximately 1/2, or $29.6 million of the district's operating expenses are for recreation services. About 1/4, or $16.4 million, are for park services. And then the remaining quarter is split between the various administration functions. Next slide, please. And with that, I believe I turn it back to Aisha.
Yes. Thank you, Jared. Okay, so remember what I said at the beginning of the presentation. This part of our discussion is not going to be easy. And for the public and for our staff, we want to be really clear. We are not proposing these exact reductions. What we are saying is that if we have to operate in a world where the reality is that we have $16 million less to spend, we will need to have some ideas or examples to understand how deeply reductions in service would have to go to balance our budget. But before we get to the details, we wanted to ground ourselves in a couple of concepts to make sure we're on the same page. So Sabrina is going to address these points.
Thank you, Aisha. We spent a lot of time talking about the mission of our organization. We're a full service park district for all ages and all abilities. We are a park and rec district. We are not a child service district, not a senior service district, not a forest district. We are Parks and Rec district. So we felt that the cuts had to be spread equally with that equity consideration in mind. We had a lot of child care centered programs right now, and that had to change if we wanted to ensure that we will continue to serve all ages in this scenario where we had such a large budget hole to fill. The unique challenge of making cuts in recreation division is we produce revenue. When we start cutting programs that bring in revenue, it actually makes the target harder to get to. The only option is to reach the reduction is to look at reducing personnel costs. That may not be seen directly associated with revenue programs, but the reality is those staff manage and supervise and support those revenue producing programs. Without the staff, we cannot offer the same level of programming. While challenging, we knew that eliminating some of our larger program areas would allow us to continue to offer a wide range of recreational services for everyone. Now, Julie is going to walk you through what some of those reductions would look like.
Good evening. Thank you, Sabrina. So when Sabrina and I went through the division, we have a total budget of 29.6 million, and our target reductions is 3.8 million.
Julie, I apologize. We want to be on the next slide. Thank you.
Next slide, sorry. To achieve this level of reductions, these are examples of how deep we'd have to go to balance. We'd be looking at the permanent closure of 3 pools and 2 splash pads. Sunset and Aloha Swim Center would have to close. The pool and splash pad at Conestoga would close, and we'd also close the Cedar Hills splash pad. We would have to end mobile recreation. As a completely subsidized service, we would no longer be able to offer any of our mobile programming. That includes nature, recreation, adaptive, and our wellness on wheels. After-school programming would end. The district would no longer be able to offer 9-month preschool. We would experience reduced service hours at all facilities district-wide. The Recreation Division would no longer have the staffing to participate in community events or to support Centro de Bienvenida. The customer engagement representatives would be eliminated. Financial aid would need to be reduced by 50%. It was very challenging to balance reductions. We know seeing some of these programs on here are painful. And without the current level of subsidy, we cannot run non-revenue programs at the current levels. Also, we must look at cutting large programs, as Sabrina said, that use many resources to continue to offer multiple recreational opportunities at our centers, such as dance, gymnastics, sports classes, to serve a broader range of patrons. This is why you see preschool and after-school programs on the list. We had to look at the division's full-time and part-time staff reductions due to losing revenue-generating programs. These staffing levels would also affect the ability to open and clean several outdoor restrooms for public use. And in the end, we'd net an impact on our people by losing about 31 full-time and a range of 135 to 233 part-time positions. We will continue to seek grants and to run core programming to help our overall expenditures. And it'll go to the next slide, and I'll pass it back to Aisha.
Thank you, Julie. In contrast to the Recreation Services Division, Park Services, which consists of those who care for our parks, trails, facilities, and natural areas, does not have a large revenue generating component. The work we do is largely oriented with providing the open, safe, and free facilities that the community enjoys. Therefore, when considering how to reduce the division's $16.4 million budget by $2.2 million, we need to look primarily at what we spend to care for these spaces. We've listed on the screen several of the ways in which we'd need to trim the budgets to reduce our spending in a significant way. These impacts will be felt by those who visit our parks. We'd focus on resources to continue care for our system, but instead of patrons seeing their favorite park techs once or twice a week in their favorite park, those visits would stretch to once every 2 weeks or once a month. We'd prioritize more frequent trash collection and restroom cleaning at our high-use sites where we have program fields and shelter reservations. We'd likely close some of our permanent restrooms seasonally and provide fewer portable restrooms throughout the year. Our capital funding would be non-existent, so turf and hard surface repairs and resurfacing projects would only be funded when there were safety concerns. And finally, we'd have to adjust our levels of service for securing land and developing parks and trails. While we do have dedicated funds to expand capacity of our system, with limited operating funds, we'd redirect funds currently spent to purchase land and develop parks and trails. In addition to the overall reductions to materials and services, the division would also experience a loss of 10 full-time positions and approximately 24 part-time positions. I'll now turn the presentation over to Holly Thompson. Next slide, please.
Okay, so this slide gives you a sense of what we would have to reduce in the communications division. The communications division encompasses the communications department, safety services, information services, our IS folks, and community programs. We have combined a $7 million budget, and our target reduction was $900,000. To meet that target reduction, we envision we would have to reduce full-time staffing by 3 positions and eliminate at least 9 part-time positions. In terms of potential impacts to service, we would be considering eliminating district-wide free community events that are completely subsidized right now through our property tax dollars. We would realize a 50% reduction in capacity in our volunteer program due to staffing reductions. We would lose the ability to have in-house graphic design for our communication pieces. We would see reductions in our ability to advertise and market district programming and activities. We would see the elimination of the buddy system for safety services calls, resulting in those calls being deferred to law enforcement. Lower priority calls such as off-leash dogs or graffiti likely wouldn't be responded to by safety services. They'd be too busy with other work. Multiple shifts would have to occur throughout the district where we just didn't have safety services personnel. And the significant gains we've made over the past 2 years in emergency management would really take a hit. We're estimating a rollback in our emergency management preparedness work by at least 75% due to time allocation. Of note, it was really challenging to balance reductions with IS in our division. IS represents about $3.5 million of that $7 million division budget, and there is really very little to anything we can afford to cut in IS. We're already way too lean in IS. We're too lean on staffing. For example, we have 1 tech for service calls in the entire district, and our IS manager is the backup to that tech right now today. So we really can't lower our investments in IS. So we had to look across the other departments within our division to meet our target. This level of cuts would be devastating to our free community events, our volunteer program, our diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and would really set back the gains that we have made. And our safety services reductions would greatly challenge our ability to meet the public's expectations for ensuring safety and livability in our park and rec system. With that, next slide, please.
All right, I'm up for HR, which includes both human resources and our risk and benefits teams. Our target reduction in this scenario that we are all working to avoid happening was $380,000. So in that parallel future universe, we would start our regular status in 4 part-time positions, which are 5 people who I know and love. In terms of potential impacts to service, we'd consider stopping the work that we've been doing in talent management, both in recruiting and in employee development and pathways to success. We would drastically cut training dollars. Training is always the first to go, to focus on compliance training. And we'd lose out on that leadership, DEI, technical skills training that we have worked really hard to add. We wouldn't be able to outsource high-risk investigations, which does put some wear and tear on our HR business partners. And we need to slow down and even reverse some of the process improvements that we've accomplished or that are currently in progress. So like IT, HR safety and risk management, we've traditionally run extremely lean to the point where compliance was a challenge. So in the last 4 years, through coming out of the pandemic, we worked really hard to build a full service division that is welcoming, knowledgeable, and supportive for our staff. We could absolutely make cuts and continue to operate, but the gains that we've made over those 4 years would be rolled back, while at the same time we have an all-time high number of employees new to THPRD or new to their position. So there would absolutely be an impact on our employment brand, both in the community and within internally, in employee engagement, performance, and retention for the folks that would be remaining here operating the district. All right, next slide.
So when we look at the finance division, it incorporates the Office of the Director, which also includes the general fund, full faith and credit debt issuances. Also within the division is finance services and the accounting and budget department. And we represent about $3.7 million of the budget next fiscal year, and our target reduction was about $504,000. And to meet that target reduction, we envision that we would have to reduce full-time staff by 1 position and eliminate all of the part-time dollars that we have. Now, in terms of potential impacts to services, we would be considering this would cause delays in processing of Oregon paid leave requests, delayed implementation of the Tyler Munis project, which would also have cause a delay in the registration system and website updates. We'd also be looking at reduced staff training and an increase in expense for borrowing funds to bridge the gap between the beginning of the fiscal year and when the first installment of property taxes comes in November. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Aisha.
Thank you, Jared. Let's see, we're through that portion of the presentation. We've given you that picture, that somewhat incredibly bleak picture of how the district would look differently if we needed to make those cuts. We're moving into the next phase of the presentation, and what I have to share with you is better news. What I'm sharing with you tonight is part of our revenue enhancement ideas, and this was also a promise we made to you when we spoke with you last month about what we would be doing with regard to a financial futures project, where we would be bringing in staff, we would be sharpening our pencils, and we'd be looking for all revenue enhancement ideas that we could come up with. So in addition to working within our organization with our staff, we also intend to bring on a consultant that's going to help us explore some new resource allocation models and possible funding options. We've officially kicked off this work by starting to hold small group discussions with staff members, where we've invited colleagues to share their thoughts in 2 directions, to give us their best ideas for untapped revenue sources, and also identifying operational efficiencies that could conserve our limited resources. I'm happy to report that I have heard some great ideas coming out of these work groups that I've spoken to so far. I'm keeping track of these ideas, and a few of these ideas are shared on the screen right now. The ideas really appeared to coalesce around 3 primary focus areas, and those were events, places, and programs. Some of these ideas we've tried before, and others are brand new concepts to us. It's important to note that while we've identified a number of options, we're still at the very beginning stage of this process. So staff have not yet determined the cost, complexity, or possible timing that we could bring these activities forward. What we do know is that while each of these items is able to bring in some level of additional funding to the district, all will need some level of resources committed to bring them into play. And even if we were to implement every idea, there would still be a significant funding gap to resolve. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about the relative levels of revenue that these ideas might generate. So here, we're just intending to show sort of that continuum, the spectrum of possible revenues that the various ideas we've discussed might generate. So on one end of the spectrum, we have on the less revenue potential side, the left side of the screen, you'll see we have smaller events that are geared toward people and dogs and park and facility rentals. These options provide great recreational opportunities to the community, align with our mission, but may not generate significant revenue. On the other side of the continuum, we have sponsorships, large-scale community events and programs, and allowing others to use district property to run fee-based programs for which we'd receive some share of the proceeds. In some cases, there'd be a significant investment required by the district, like in the example of the dedicated pickleball facility, that would be offset by user fees. In almost all cases, there'd be a period of time in which we'd be developing the concept and marketing it to our patrons with the hope that the idea would become popular and revenue producing. But none of these ideas, even if combined all together, would provide the certainty and stability that THPRD needs to address its future funding challenges. Next slide, and I'll hand it off to Holly.
Okay. Doug, I don't know if before I start you want to say anything, or I can jump in, whatever you like.
Yeah, I can certainly, again, We took to heart part of the board's message at your last meeting, really getting into the subject matter of we need to develop and research and do some thoughtful process on all aspects of revenue potential. So I hope the board sees that even in the front end of the discussion, the difficulty and challenge of identifying cuts is just painful, as we all know. I could see it in your faces. You know, it's really a challenging circumstance. However, the reminder is the good news is we have time. In the process of going through this, the management team and I, we agree 100% with your guidance that we need to build maximum robust revenue enhancement options. We need to ensure we're exploring all of those options. But it does identify clearly, you know, that donut hole that is predominantly white being the gap that is created. The creative ideas will make a difference. The program potentials will make a difference. But it is a reality we have to acknowledge that in order to really fill the gap from a sustainable, long-term, with certainty and stability, there's really only one pathway forward, and it is the opportunity to explore asking our voters to support an operating levy. And our recommendation continues to be just that we take our time to explore all these options, including the levy option. As you will see from Holly's presentation upcoming here, you'll see that it's going to take some time to really develop this and ensure that we're thoughtful as we continue down our approach. You know, I think with Holly's information, that certainly we're close to the end here of the presentation to create some dialogue and input back from the board. So with that, Holly, please.
Thank you, Doug. So let's add some lightness back into the discussion. So this slide is really meant to remind us what our peer agencies are working on, what they rely on. You know, think back to the slide that Jared shared about the impact of Measure 50 and how that really strongly impacts local governments. And we talked about it last month's presentation, the measures that had passed most recently in November 2022, right? We know that in Washington County, well, beyond that, the Metro measure passed, the PCC measure passed, and the Beaverton School District measure passed. This is further information on the history of operating levies that are very common in our county, and our public service peers rely on operating levies and renewing those levies for their funding. So we wanted to share this information, more examples, wanted to remind ourselves that we have great models to learn from. We have great history in the county of what worked well, how did people get there, and again, the wisdom of what our peer agencies are doing. Why are they relying on local option levies? Because like us, they understand it's really the best option to provide that stability and certainty in terms of funding. The other thing that I wanted to do is just contextualize the whole picture of what we looked at. You know, I totaled up across the division. Each director looked at their divisions independently, but when you combine it, the level of cuts that we would have to make totaled 46 full-time equivalent positions. We only have 207 full-time employees total. So 46 would represent 22% of our workforce. Almost 1 out of 4 THPRD employees would not have a job if we do not fill this funding gap. And that's why that certainty in that funding gap is so important. Our part-time employee base would be drastically impacted as well. The combined loss of part-time employees would be 174 to 272. For folks listening, that range is because at different times of the year, particularly like summer, for example, we have different employees doing different things, and we would lose a good chunk. Today, you know, we run between 400 and 800 part-time employees. So a range of 174 to 272, it would be significant. Pre-pandemic, we had anywhere from 800 to 1,200 part-time employees. So, you know, we're still building back, and it would be really challenging. Next slide, please. So we also took to heart the discussion we had last month about how important it is, if we think about the impact of a property tax increase, that that would not have a good positive impact on many families that are struggling. We really appreciated the board's perspective of, please pay attention, think of mitigation strategies. One thing we struggled with at the cuts, and I want to be clear, when we were crafting those scenarios, we really weren't able to think about mitigation strategies in the same way, right? In a world where you have to cut one out of every $4 or $5, that's way more challenging. But in a world where we would be enacting or asking voters to support a property tax levy, it gives us the ability to think about how to mitigate those additional cost increases. The other thing we wanted to do was just contextualize and think about, what is property taxes and what are we, THPRD? Remember, we're not a business. We're a government agency. We're a public service. We're a collective community good. And it is the strength of the investment of the community in property taxes today that enables the free programming and the meaningful access to people. So it's a different way to think about investment in property taxes of, yes, there are costs that get carried forward, but it's that investment in that revenue stream that allows the free programming that expands meaningful access to people. It is the tool that allows you to do that, to ensure that people are getting meaningful access. But in terms of how we would mitigate the impact of a levy, we have many ideas to pull from our scholarship assessment report that we did in 2019. They looked at things like thinking of the methodology, so the way that we give aid, reducing more barriers to that, creating culturally specific partnerships and expanding those efforts, thinking about not giving financial aid in terms of dollars, but in terms of access to programming and spots. So there are lots of things that we could do concurrently as we build toward a levy option to be ensuring meaningful access to folks who need it the most, who are struggling with financial impacts. But without the tool of the levy, our ability to mitigate is very much hindered. Next slide, please. So in terms of next steps, again, we're not asking y'all for decisions this evening, but we are looking for a direction. So the management team's recommendations for your consideration are to encourage us to continue the work of revenue enhancement strategies, to continue the work of the Financial Futures Group, to continue to explore the operating levy concept. And on the next slide, I'll show you what that could look like, and to give us the green light that, yes, we need to engage some professional services to help us refine those pictures. You know, there's a reason right now you're not seeing a concept of a levy being X per 1,000, right? We're nowhere near there. We know what our funding gap is, but we need to do some research. We need to understand what level of investment our public was willing to support, and we need to match up that level of investment with what we can deliver. We also need to get research on how to communicate with our public with specificity on this issue. And so allowing this time and allowing that work to do would really help. The second thing we want to do is continue to keep the dialogue flowing. We have many audiences. We have our board. You're the decision makers that are going to have to help us pick the course. And we want to make sure we're getting you all the information that you need to make the decisions that you feel you need to make. We envision having updates with you again in May and in June. And we also want to continue active engagement with our staff. This is a big topic, right? And there's a lot of feels for staff on this topic. Since we last met in March, we held 4 staff sessions. We had 3 of those were, or 2 were in person, 2 were virtual. So we had a mix of options. And we had 163 staff attend those sessions. And I have to tell you, we've got a lot of staff who have worked at other agencies. And the feedback has been, thank you for communicating early, for communicating often on this topic, for being fully transparent. And they are feeling informed, and they understand where we're coming from and our approach. And we'll be sending out an all staff communication tomorrow as a follow-up to today's presentation to keep the dialogue going with our staff, to get ahead of their questions and to make sure that they are fully informed on what's going on. And we've started messaging in our public communications. So you've probably seen some information about some budget challenges that we're starting to put out there just to raise awareness with our public. And on the next slide, I wanted to run through just kind of high level overview concept of if we do kind of get that thumbs up that yes, we want you to continue to research the levy concept and we want more information about this. This slide kind of gives you a picture of how we would accomplish this work. We imagine between now and June, we would continue our scoping, our research, and our preparation phase. We would then envision starting in July through the end of the calendar year, we would be heavy in public engagement, and we do that thoughtfully and we do that well here at THPRD. We would have a levy task force that would help us understand and think about these issues, that help us understand what to communicate to the public about these issues, how to help get folks on board to understand the choices that we're asking. And it really is a choice of the community. What level of investment do you want to make to ensure park and rec services in this community? All of this would be gearing towards preparing us potentially for a May 2024 election, and there would not be any formal action by the board until January of 2024 to prepare us for that. So that's comments.
Thank you for that very informative presentation. I'm sure there's lots of questions and thoughts. Who would like to go first? I talk plenty. Alfredo, go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, thank you for the information. I would say the worst case scenario certainly got my attention, and I imagine would get lots of other people's attention as well. I think, yeah. I mean, you have my support in the direction you're going. I think for me, it's important that while these are very successful, and this community is generally very supportive of its public agencies, I think it's just important to do, that old yes and, like, while I can see the clear need for the levy and the community investment on all the things that this community at large enjoys about the district. I think as we go through this process, just for me, kind of having showing that meaningful effort on behalf of the district for both financial stewardship and revenue generation, and being able to articulate that. I don't know if we if that's something we absolutely have to do in this area, just speaking frankly, but I think it's important for us that we're being smart with this ask, and so showing that we're making a good faith effort to kind of meet the taxpayer part of the way, if not halfway. I think it is good. That's not saying like we vow to lop off this many programs. I think it's just being able to articulate that we're not just keep giving it to us and we'll keep finding ways to spend it. I think it's just kind of, we're working smarter, we're looking for new ways, while at the same time, we don't want you to lose these programs that you hold so dear and that your families have loved for, for decades and generations. So that's really my main comment. So I will move along to somebody else.
Thanks, Alfredo. Heidi.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. And I really appreciate the tangibles of what does this mean, as difficult as it is to view that and see that, and understanding the impact that also has on staff currently. Just want to recognize that. But I'm grateful because I think we had some numbers, but we didn't have, this many centers and this many programs. And these are the things that are really going to be impacted. And these are the people and the employees and the layoffs that we would face. That messaging is very important to me in order for me to understand as a board member, but as a taxpayer and a district participant or patron, what this looks like. I agree with Alfredo that even with that information, I think it's still important that we consider the messaging as it relates to what are we still going to be doing to be innovative and to look at those greater revenue opportunities that we have moving forward, such as sponsorships or being the ropes course concessionaire, those types of things. I'm in support of moving forward with continuing to investigate and look and see and frame how we might go out with this for something May 2024. And Holly, I just want to put out, I also appreciate the language around, the strength of the investment allows for, the programming that we provide and the free services that we provide and the opportunities and the facilities that cost more than they ever have in the past as well. So thank you for all the deliverables that you provided tonight. And I'm in support of moving forward to see, how we can move forward with this.
Thanks, Heidi. Tia?
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, so I'm fine with moving forward and continuing on. I think I have like summer camp things in my head and stuff because that's around the corner and we've been thinking about it and there's been so much discussion. But I'd like to see also like if we did have this operation cost, I'm assuming our prices have gone up because of our staffing and our budget problems and stuff, but we are no longer that competitive. We are not, right? Like you can find tennis classes outside, like tennis camps, they're cheaper at Oak Hills, right? Or with like certain things like sports camp, Sports Quest does it at Saltman for cheaper for all day. Like all of our prices are, so I don't know if that's also, we'll see how that affects like, because there's supply and demand, but we are no longer, if we're a government funded agency and we're supposed, like you would think that we would be the cheaper options. You can go work out somewhere for $10 a month. Like all of that kind of stuff just doesn't make sense from a public perspective of like, I'm paying tax dollars. It's, we have free activities. I get the perks, but like our activities should be cheaper than like, if you go to a Planet Fitness or like this tennis people who are running these summer camps or, all of these things. So that's only something that I just want to make sure that when we have this operation levy, like what the public won't just see that everything's operational, like we need to be very competitive in pricing. And so that's just kind of my thought right now, because it'll be interesting to see what our summer looks like, considering everybody has been saying things are cheaper outside. And I've seen the same thing, right? Like we have a lot of summer camps that we've already registered for because I already know that they're going to be cheaper than THPRD. So.
Thanks, Tia. I'm going to jump to Barbie and then Heidi. Can't hear you.
Y'all, it's not my first time at the rodeo, I promise. Thank you for the great presentation. I won't wax on too long other than to advocate for my support that we continue to move forward. It's interesting what I'm hearing from my peers, how I'm ingesting it sounds like we're mutual support, but there's a lot of concern around messaging. So it's interesting. I don't think you're hearing any of us thus far think that there's a way in which we can fill this gap without moving forward. But I think you're hearing there's concerns in which how do we go about the process? So I would echo those same concerns, and simplicity is key. I will just offer, when my mother was teaching me about how to balance my checkbook and how to do economics, she came up with this thing called the theory of the puts. I might have shared it with some of you all, but I think it's very easy. The theory of the puts goes like this, which is if your output is more than your input, you're put out. And fortunately, I think that's the kind of situation that we're in here. And while I'm super excited about some of the innovative ideas, the picture has been painted very clear that we need to do something beyond just some innovative ideas with programming and whatnot to be able to fill this gap. So thanks for the tremendous work, hearing our concerns, coming back. I'll pass the mic back over to Heidi.
Thank you. I guess my mic was already on. I just want to respond briefly to what Tio had to say about cheaper, more affordable services out in the community beyond the park district. I also want to recognize that we work really hard to make sure that our employees are well paid, have benefits, move from part-time to full-time employment if they want, paid internships, all of those pieces. So I think, unfortunately, in our economy and the state of being right now, it's really easy to pay very little for employees or people to provide these services. And what we're trying to do is make sure that we are providing the competitive wages. So I want to recognize staff in this, because this messaging is really tough. And while there may be more affordable services, I don't know that we're looking to, I mean, sure, we want affordable services, but we also want employees who are long-term with us, trained, well, versed in the work that they do. So I needed to respond to that in light of our employee and staff base.
Go ahead,
Thank
Holly.
you.
Thank you, Lisa. I wanted to respond to the messaging with just kind of a preview to what my philosophy will be on this. As a communications director, a lot of times the messaging, the work that I do is kind of ruled by my gut, by my professional experience, by my history in the community, all of this. Barbie, I love what you said of this isn't my first rodeo with the technology. I'm going to borrow from that. I've had the opportunity to work on asks of voters in this community before, 3 times. So I've got a lot of experience on working on voter asks in our community. And what I can tell you is it will be really important to be data driven. Part of the reason we're asking for time for research and we're looking for that head nod is we want to make sure that this is the road you want to go down. And it's great. I hear very loud and clear, keep going. Because we'll be working with a firm that will help us on getting that messaging right. And part of getting that messaging right is really listening to the public to understand what connects the most. And on any given topic, there might be a range of 6 to 8 reasons why you think like something's really important. But what really matters is getting to the 2 or 3 reasons that the public, because ultimately, if we go down the road of an operating levy, it is a question of the voters, right? It's not a question. The board's choice is, do we want to refer this to the voters? And it's the voters' choice of, is this a worthy investment? So we'll really be doing data-informed research to understand the views of our voters on park and rec services and making sure that our messaging most aligns with their values, their appreciation, and their willingness to invest in services. This is a time where I could use your support, because I always say, Doug, you can smile at me because I'm smiling at you on this one. I always say to like my bosses or my colleagues or elected officials around me, we might talk about something we know a little differently, because it's important when we're in this kind of voter ask levy campaign effort that we really connect with voters in a way that they understand and will evaluate it. And we need to provide the information they need, and we need to communicate in a way that pops and connects with them. So it might look different and it might feel different, but that's our target audience in this scenario. Thank you.
Thanks, Holly. A couple thoughts I wanted to share. I absolutely think we should move forward with exploring the levy. I think it's the responsible thing to do, because I mean, if you were to ask us today what should we do, I'd say, well, we don't have enough information. We need more information. My head jumps to polling, but I know that's not necessarily the very next step, but I know that's one of many next steps that I'm curious about. A few things that give me pause, that give me legit heart palpitations are, one, what this means for our community in terms of cost of living. I take that really seriously, and I know my peers do too. Because we can't mitigate rent increases. So we need to think about that. And I know these are very serious decisions regardless. You have painted a very clear picture of some tough decisions that we have to make, and what are the long-term impacts of what it would mean for, as an example, to close a swim center. Those are really serious conversations and things for us to reflect on. I also can't help but be mindful and conscious of other things that will be on the ballot in 2024. How do we stand out? At what point will there be voter fatigue? I do not know the answer to that. While I appreciate the framing of like the voters get to choose, like I want to go in with a level of confidence, right? I think you do too, Holly. None of us like losing. So those are just the things that I'm mindful of. I think you are presenting us with arguably maybe the greatest challenge that we've had in a couple of years. And I mean, there's an opportunity here too, and I'm mindful of that. So I think we have a lot more to learn. I really appreciate staff's leadership. I appreciate all the number crunching that went in today's presentation. And I imagine like emotions that went in today's presentations as I'm having an emotional reaction to it. So just really appreciative of everyone's hard work. That's all I got.
Perfect. Well, thank you, board members. I think we clearly got, the input we were looking for, the response of we have more research to do, more information together, and we respect that. That's a critical component to the decision-making process. So with that, we can, if the board would desire to, we can close up work session. We can go ahead and move right into executive session if you would like. I think it's another meeting, of course. We'll log off and back on, but we can do that and continue on to give you hopefully a better break between executive session and the open meeting.
Sold, Doug. I'll see you all in
right.
30 seconds. Close in
Very
work
good.
session. Thank you.
Thank you.